Welcome.
The Resident Evil series has always been about starting over and trying again. Whether that be the first game helping establish survival horror, Resident Evil 4 reinventing the third-person shooter and pushing the gameplay towards action, or Resident Evil 7 Biohazard moving the series into first person and towards more intimate scares. And that's not to mention the full-fledged remakes the first 3 Resident Evil games have received, updating them for modern sensibilities. Multiple times, when the series formula got stale, developer-publisher Capcom has gone back to the drawing board, reassessing what it means to be a Resident Evil game. Few games have had the impact on pop culture that the Resident Evil series has. Numerous individual entries have completely reshaped the game industry and how games are designed. The movie series it birthed, which ran for 6 films across more than 10 years, made over $1 billion in box office revenue. No matter how you slice it, Resident Evil is a big deal. Always changing the world, always starting over, always trying something new. To celebrate Resident Evil's 25th anniversary, we wanted to look back at the series, highlighting the most important entries that have come out to date. In doing so, we explore the conditions that led to their development, their initial impact, and what their legacies have meant for the broader series. Both good and bad. This is nowhere near a comprehensive list, but rather a hand selection of which Resident Evil games have meant most for the franchise overall. Resident Evil didn't invent horror games. In fact, in some ways, the first Resident Evil was Capcom recycling some older ideas. As the story goes, the earliest conversations around the series began when Capcom producer Tokuro Fujiwara approached Shinji Mikami to make a horror game using systems designed for Sweet Home, a game Fujiwara directed in 1989, released in tandem with a movie of the same name, directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. These systems included environmental puzzles, item management and limited inventory, and even door animations for loading screens. The game's setting, a mansion, was also lifted for Mikami's new project, which he would direct with Fujiwara serving as producer. Interestingly, Mikami said in the past that when developing the first Resident Evil, he tried to free himself of pre-established genres. Because he feared how a horror game might sell, he wanted to make a game that wasn't normal. By all estimations, this was a gamble. Resident Evil, telling a story about a police unit trapped in a labyrinthian mansion full of zombies and other awful creatures, combines a hodgepodge of different elements and influences, all the way from Sweet Home to George Romero's Night of the Living Dead to meticulous puzzle design. It made, at the time, a game unlike much else on the market. It also introduced characters that would become series staples, and arguably some of the most popular in video games, like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, and Barry Burton. Viewing Resident Evil with 2021 sensibilities, a lot of these design decisions, despite their lasting impact, make little sense. Not to say they did in 1996 either when the game was released, but there were fewer questions asked back then. The game's setting, Spencer Mansion, is a convoluted fortress full of not only zombies but impossibly large snakes and sharks for seemingly no other reason than they're kind of scary. The puzzles, obtuse and challenging in sometimes satisfying ways, have never matched the narrative. The pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera perspectives, which are actually inspired by the first Alone in the Dark game, were a result of technical limitations, but did inadvertently add to Resident Evil's unique visual framing. Fixed cameras would be a staple of the series all the way until Resident Evil 4. So while it wasn't the very first horror game, what Resident Evil did invent, or at least popularize, was the idea of survival horror as a video game genre. While Sweet Home was certainly influential, Resident Evil took Fujiwara's ideas and made them appealing to a mainstream audience. It proved that video games were not only an effective medium for horror, but also a medium people wanted to experience horror in. According to Capcom, the original release of Resident Evil on the PlayStation has sold more than 2.75 million copies, and that's not factoring in ports, the director's cuts, and various other editions of the game. It also launched Resident Evil as a multimedia franchise, and a big one at that. Since its release in 1996, across 141 different titles, which include mainline sequels, ports, remakes, and the like, the Resident Evil series has sold more than 107 million units. More profoundly, Resident Evil inspired some of the greatest games ever made. There would likely be no Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, or Dead Space, at least not in their current incarnations, without the framework of the original Resident Evil. In the video game world at least, it launched Mikami into stardom, which his later work in the series would help solidify. And yet, for Mikami, who helped dream it all up, his feelings come across a little conflicted. During the time when we were making it, my personal feeling was that Resident Evil was not a game that should be made into a series, Mikami told GameSpot in 2016. This is because horror tends to have strong patterns that are easy to get used to, meaning they're easy to get tired of. I never thought that the game would become such a huge hit. I can't help thinking that if Resident Evil hadn't sold so well, maybe I could have spent that period in my 30s doing creative work as a studio director instead of working as a producer. Although I still feel like a very lucky man to be able to have those kinds of worries. Whether or not he wanted it, Resident Evil obviously did become a series, and the formula established in the first game would serve future installments well, until it didn't. Eventually, enough sequels later, what was groundbreaking in the first Resident Evil became trite and predictable, and so Capcom went back to the drawing board to reinvent the genre it helped invent in the first place. If you've played video games at any point in the last 15 years, you've felt the impact of Resident Evil 4. It's one of the most influential games of all time. But Resident Evil 4's development was troubled, and in fact, the finished product is the 5th attempt at making the game happen. Development originally began in 1999, following the release of Resident Evil 3, but despite several directors trying their hands at different ways to make it, nothing stuck until Mikami came on board a few years later. While games like Resident Evil 2 and 3 and Code Veronica were well received, and have remained fan favorites, by that point the Resident Evil formula was exactly that, formulaic. Capcom developers, like Mikami, were feeling this too. Speaking to Game Informer in 2004, the developer cited Resident Evil 0, released in 2002, as his personal breaking point. I remember playing Resident Evil 0 and saying to myself that this is just more of the same, Mikami said. This is why I wanted to change the system. With the new system, I once again feel nervous and scared when I play it. Resident Evil 4 stands as an inflection point for the series. On the one hand, it marks the first major changes for Resident Evil. Zombies technically are gone, replaced with the undead Ganados, who still shamble around but also possess the ability to communicate with each other and use weapons. The T-Virus, the reason everyone is a zombie in previous entries, is replaced by the Las Plagas, a parasite that takes over the host's body, turning them homicidal and easy to control, and even ejecting from the host as needed to protect itself from danger. The biggest change in Resident Evil 4, though, is its gameplay, and how that gameplay is presented to the player. While the first Resident Evil game adopted fixed camera angles out of technical limitations, which later games embraced since it became a series staple, Resident Evil 4 put the camera behind the back of protagonist Leon Kennedy, giving players more freedom to look around the environment when exploring or aiming. Leon is also placed off-center to the left during gameplay, allowing players to look over his shoulder while aiming. This is, of course, the standard camera perspective for all third-person shooters at this point. But at the time, this was a novel concept, and not a proven formula. In our Resident Evil 4 cover story from 2004, former editor-in-chief Andy McNamara remarked at how responsive the camera perspective was when aiming. When in third person, Leon fills the far left side of the screen, which we thought would make aiming nearly impossible until we actually got our hands on the title, McNamara wrote. The game really feels like you are playing a first-person shooter, with or without Leon on screen. Before we go any further, it's worth pointing out that Resident Evil Dead Aim, released in 2003, also featured a behind-the-back camera perspective, making it the first in the series to do so. It also didn't have fixed camera angles, but the main character was centered on screen, which was customary for the time. Its aiming system was also set in first person, which we'll get to later. It also featured full 3D environments. Resident Evil 4 started to move the series away from typical survival horror toward action. While a lot of the standard Resident Evil trappings are still in the game, such as inventory management, low ammo, and the fact it can be scary at times, the back half of Resident Evil 4 leans much further into set pieces and large-scale action. This move, by and large, works for Resident Evil 4, if only evident by the number of times the game shows up on greatest games of all time lists. However, it's undeniable the negative ramifications this move had on the broader series, and how, once again, it'd lead to another reinvention a decade later. There's a safe argument to be made that Resident Evil 4 was too good at what it does, balancing horror and action in a way that gave Capcom the wrong ideas in where to take later games. Resident Evil 5, and certainly Resident Evil 6, largely abandoned horror for action, and while those games aren't without their merits, eventually the definition of a Resident Evil game became nebulous. Resident Evil was a survival horror series historically, but now is also an action series, and there were multiplayer shooters coming out as well. It was a lot of things at once, very few of which were making anyone happy. This makes Resident Evil 4 an interesting game from a historical perspective. On the one hand, even playing in 2021, it's fantastic. It still controls remarkably well, has effective scares, and the action is exciting. Mikami's gamble was not only successful for the time, but made a fairly timeless video game. On the other hand, with hindsight, you can see the ways in which it nearly tanked the entire series, or at least fan opinion of it. While you could argue the spin-offs Resident Evil Revelations and Revelations 2 were both focused on survival horror, by 2012's Resident Evil 6, the mainline series had more in common with Die Hard than it did Night of the Living Dead. But Capcom was listening to fans. Behind the scenes, it was planning not only Resident Evil's next reinvention, but how to take the series back to its roots. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is simultaneously a return to Resident Evil's roots and the biggest reinvention of the series yet. The first most notable change is another shift in perspective. Again, barring the combat at dead aim, which shifted from third to first person when aiming your gun, Biohazard is the first game in the series set in first person, telling the story of series newcomer Ethan Winters as he searches for his missing wife Mia. While a lot of the Resident Evil staples are still in Biohazard, the switch in perspective makes the horror remarkably intimate compared to later Resident Evil games. Which is a big deal, as first and foremost, the game is returning Resident Evil to pure survival horror. However, that horror of Biohazard is wholly unique to the series. Whereas earlier games took inspiration from the movies of George Romero and science fiction, Biohazard leans heavily on slasher films. While the idea to scale the game back to only one location came from Sam Raimi's 1981 movie The Evil Dead, the most obvious inspiration for Biohazard is Tobe Hooper's 1974 film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where a group of friends encounter a family of cannibals, the most notable being Leatherface, a mute man who favors a chainsaw when murdering his victims. This inspiration is felt everywhere in Biohazard, including 2 chainsaw boss fights, which, to be fair, are also a big part of Evil Dead. Most apparent, though, is the game's setting, which takes place in Louisiana rather than Texas, but still draws just as heavily on the American South for inspiration. Like the homestead in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Baker Estate in Biohazard is a southern home from hell, where ostensibly a family might have lived a normal life there at one point. Now the houses are in disarray, and both rely on themes of human and animal decay to reinforce the idea of a family gone wrong. While troublingly, this does often rely on stereotypes about who lives in the South, crazy, dangerous people, it also helps to create an oppressive and isolated atmosphere, where help doesn't immediately come and horror is found in the helplessness of the situation. At times, Biohazard's horror borders on nihilism, impressing upon the player that nothing they do matters, that this danger will always be there. By the end of the game, you do escape, but judging by trailers for Resident Evil Village, Biohazard's direct sequel, that sense of helplessness is reinforced by the fact Winter's peaceful life is upended by more tragedy. While it doesn't commit in the same way to taboo subject matter, Biohazard is a rare example of a AAA game borrowing from some pretty interesting corners of horror cinema. Its portrayal of Southerners on the fringe is certainly reminiscent of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, about a family that encounter a group of cannibals in the Nevada desert. The way it interjects found footage to flesh out its backstory has some very direct homages to the Blair Witch Project, while also giving off the same "am I allowed to be seeing this" vibes of other pseudo-found footage documentaries like Cannibal Holocaust and the Poughkeepsie tapes, of which the final 2, like Biohazard, also rely on bleak, unflinching violence and torture. There's also a healthy dose of the Saw series in there, for good measure. It's honestly hard to think of many other AAA games that share DNA with any of these examples, and while it's hard to say Biohazard was inspired by every single aforementioned movie, the fact it inhabits a similar media space as any of them is a pretty unique place for a video game to be in. All of this is to say, Biohazard is a swing for the fences. It's Resident Evil returning to its roots in terms of some mechanics and the simple fact it's scary, but it's also completely reimagining what a Resident Evil game can be going forward. While it likely won't be the last time the series is reinvented or reimagined, it serves as a line in the sand in terms of how Capcom sees the Resident Evil franchise. Something open to experimentation while still retaining the core of what made the original games work. While Resident Evil Village didn't lean towards all of the same extremes Biohazard did, it already shows the series going in more new directions. this time with lycanthropy, vampirism, and occult horror, while also remaining in first person. Resident Evil is no longer just the story of Umbrella, the T-Virus, and zombies. Biohazard shows that Resident Evil can be anything, and given that the game is Capcom's second best-selling game of all time, it's safe to assume the gamble worked. Unlike earlier Resident Evil games, which we can view with hindsight, it may take us a while to fully grasp the impact Biohazard has on the series. Regardless, it'll be fascinating to watch how Resident Evil evolves moving forward. While Biohazard is a look at the future of Resident Evil, it's only part of the overall story. In 2019, Capcom released Resident Evil 2. Again, however, similar to 2002's Resident Evil Remake, which updated the 1996 original for modern sensibilities, the new Resident Evil 2 was a complete overhaul of the 1998 game, made with Capcom's modern RE engine, which was first designed for Biohazard, but has also been used on Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter Rise, and more. Whereas Biohazard went first person, RE2 Remake remains third person, but trades in the original's fixed camera angles for the behind the shoulder look of Resident Evil 4 and later games. Barring that and a few other changes, it is a relatively faithful remake for modern times. And it's scary too. Navigating a young Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield through the Raccoon City police station, there's a sense of dread permeating the RE2 remake. Zombies are now persistent, meaning if you don't kill one, they'll be there the next time you walk through whatever wing of the station you didn't finish the job in. After enough hours, you know the game's map like the back of your hand, and you know where the worst dangers wait for you. The game loses some steam when it leaves the police station, but its first half is easily some of the best survival horror in the series. Zombies, by this point a cliche for not only Resident Evil, but media in general, actually take on a new sense of danger in the RE2 remake. You have to be smart when navigating the game and taking on threats. But this is all without mentioning the biggest threat in RE2 Remake, Mr. X, an impossibly large tyrant that constantly and persistently stalks you during your playthrough. While Mr. X was in the original Resident Evil 2, technical limitations meant he was constrained to more scripted events. In RE2 Remake, he's a dynamic threat, constantly walking around the police station at the same time you are. You can even hear his footsteps on other floors of the building as you walk around. The police department is not so big that it's unmanageable. Eventually you will expertly know your way around and can get to and from pretty easily. That is, until Mr. X shows up. He can't be killed, only stunned, and does a massive amount of damage. He's a constant thorn in your side, and a great way to amplify your anxiety while playing the game, as there's no way to really stop him. Eventually he will show up, throwing a wrench in your plans, and you will have to quickly adapt. RE2 Remake proves that the groundwork established by the oldest games in the series is still effective, just with a modern coat of polish. As of this video, the game is Capcom's third best-selling game of all time, behind only Monster Hunter World and Biohazard, numbers 1 and 2 respectively. Considering Biohazard and RE2 Remake together, it paints a pretty interesting picture for the future of the series. One that looks at the past and future equally while reimagining and reinventing all the same. This is most evident when looking at the Resident Evil 3 Nemesis remake that came out in 2020, which played identically to RE2 Remake, and Resident Evil Village, which retains Biohazard's characters and camera perspective. Armchair speculation indicates remakes of older games will get the same treatment as RE2 Remake, while mainline games will go the way of Biohazard, but we can't say that for sure. At the very least, it is difficult to imagine Capcom not using the third-person perspective it pioneered in at least the heavily rumored Resident Evil 4 Remake. Where Resident Evil 9 and beyond go is anyone's guess right now, and we're years from finding out. Regardless, Resident Evil's time as a punchline, most common during the Resident Evil 5 and 6 eras, is in the rearview mirror, at least for now. While the Resident Evil 3 remake wasn't as well received as the RE2 remake, it's still one of Capcom's best-selling games of all time. Additionally, Resident Evil Village is one of 2021's most anticipated games, and the rumored RE4 remake is also hotly anticipated, though obviously still unconfirmed. Through ups and downs, 25 years later, the Resident Evil series is still a juggernaut. While it's hard to say new releases have the same influence older games did, they are still a big deal. And as we look toward the future of Resident Evil, considering the way Capcom is constantly changing the formula, trying new, weird, and unproven things, we're excited to see where we'll be scared next.